Hi, everybody. I'm Sheila Paluzzi, and I'll be hosting the webinar this evening. I'm going to give a few moments for people to get connected and logged on. We have quite a crew kind of joining this evening, which I'm really excited about. So perhaps while everyone's getting logged in, I'll just start by introducing myself. For those of you who aren't familiar with who I am, my name is Sheila Paluzzi, and I am a social worker. I have a private practice at the Healing Loft in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and I'm also co-director of Mental Health Foundations. This evening, we're going to be talking about triggers, emotional triggers specifically, which I've done a lot of personal work with, but I also help a lot of clients in terms of individual sessions and also in couples therapy, work through emotional triggers and get to know what theirs are. So I'm really excited about the content tonight. I'm going to, okay, we've got lots of people on. Depending on wherever you are in this world or what time zone you're in, I hope you're having a great day so far. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen so I can get the presentation up for you and allow us to get right into the material. Sorry, no, it's not changing. There we go. So I've introduced myself, and I did want to just review kind of the intention of Mental Health Foundations. I know it's Natasha, Nadell, and I offer a variety of resources and webinars to clinicians, but in what we present to the public in terms of individual webinars and couple webinars and for caregivers. We really, in our hearts, wanted to be able to make these resources free for everybody. And, I do want to, I guess, put a bit of the disclosure that this webinar won't take place of, therapeutic intervention or one-on-one therapy, but hopefully you can get some useful information as well as some strategies out of the webinar. But if you are you find even after the webinar you're significantly struggling with some emotional triggers, do encourage you to reach out in your area for individual therapy and one-on-one therapy so that you can get the support that you may require. I put feel free to take screenshots. So as I go through this presentation, there will be some strategies that I will introduce. So if you want to take a screenshot, absolutely feel welcome to do so. In terms of how the setup is for webinars, I cannot see anybody. So I don't see any faces, which can make it a little awkward when, wanting to be socially engaging. I don't have any feedback, but we set it up that way for a couple of reasons. One, because we do videotape the webinar and put it on our website after, so we just want to protect privacy. So invite you, if you're in your jammies or if at any point throughout the webinar you just want to close your eyes and listen so that you can be rest assured you're not being watched and or judged in any way. So that being said, if you do have questions or you do want to add some feedback at any point throughout the webinar, you'll notice, I believe it's the same for everybody on your computers, but at the bottom middle of your screen, there's a little box that says Q&A. So you can type in any questions or feedback, or if there's something that you're wanting a little bit more information on or that isn't quite clear, feel free to use that box to dialogue, and I will try to be as responsive as possible. I've done it a couple different ways, saving everything to the end as we go along. I'm going to try to do it as we go along, just because sometimes there's some very valuable questions as I'm covering some of the material. So feel free to use that dialogue box if you need to connect with me in any way, because again, I can't visually see anybody. I mentioned already that this will be recorded, so if you're wanting to return to any of the messages or review any of it, there's a little experiential that we'll be doing. So if you want to review that or do that in the future, you can come back to this at any time. It will be put up on our website If I'm being really proactive, it'll be up tonight within an hour of the webinar, if not within a few days. And I am going to link one of the experientials that we're going to do this evening as well. There's a handout sheet, so I will link that on the website underneath the video as well, so you can access that for free. And I do encourage, if you don't have a pen and paper, to get some now, or something, even if it's on your phone, in your notes. There are a few opportunities where we're going to be processing triggers, where you can write down your responses, and they'll be important when we go into the experiential. So you can take a moment now and get a pen and paper if you'd like, or get set up for that. And so the agenda for the evening, I'm going to review the basics of emotional triggers. I've noticed that word gets used in a lot of different contexts, so I'll do a little bit of clarification in terms of what we're speaking about tonight, how they impact us, how they even come to be, what an emotional trigger is. And then we're going to learn ways that we can recognize and identify, our triggers in the moment. And the really, for me, in my personal work, the most important piece was learning how to work through them, so that we can be different in those situations and circumstances going forward. So I use the word raw spots as well. It's a terminology from Sue Johnson, an emotion-focused therapy for couples. So I may use those interchangeably throughout the webinar. But what emotional triggers are, they are strong, sometimes overwhelming emotional or physiological reaction to what is going on in a given or certain situation. It's not the same as, just having an uncomfortable feeling. So the difference would be if, your boss comes to you and gives you some feedback in terms of needing to improve your job performance in some way. If your reaction is, maybe slightly defensive or a little bit annoyed, that is not likely an emotional trigger. That is just an emotional response. If your boss comes to you and is needing you to improve your job performance in some way, and your response, one, is incredibly visceral, and maybe after they walk away, you're cursing their name, or how dare they say that? They have no idea how hard I work. I shouldn't even work here anymore. They don't appreciate me. So if it's that really, really, really strong reaction, chances are there might be an emotional trigger there. It's not the same as a trauma trigger. They're much more complex, and I won't get into all of the details of it, but there are differences between emotional triggers and trauma triggers. And the other part, like the aspect of it, is it's an out of proportion reaction. And I love this analogy. I heard it from somewhere. I didn't create it, but I really, really connected with it. So when we're in an emotional trigger, the channel is right, but the volume is too high. So for the example of, receiving some negative feedback from a supervisor or a higher up, to have some sort of response, makes sense, or to be, whether it's nervous or a little bit frustrated because maybe you're trying really hard, the channel is right. But in that second example where it was, I hate my boss, they're so whatever, he or she is such a this, shouldn't even work here. The volume of that reaction is too high. So the flavor of it, or the channel, is right, but the volume's up too high. And when this happens, it leads to reactionary behaviors. So you may be able to recall in your relationships times when you've been triggered, and these behaviors, when I look back when I've been triggered, There's sometimes those kind of cringy behaviors when I'm like, oh, I really wish I didn't go there, or I didn't say that, or, you know, I wish I would have maybe, you know, stayed calmer in that moment. Because often our behaviors can be very reactionary. So whether that comes out as being really defensive or attacking, or sometimes it could be like a complete shutdown. I know there's sometimes when I've been triggered, and I'm thinking mostly like in my marriage relationship, where I've just shut down. And even though I'm not yelling or attacking or defending, that is my defense in the moment. And I may look as though I'm not having emotion, but internally my physiology is just firing. So an example that I can give you, it's a trigger I've done work on, so it's not a huge issue. It's something I'm aware of. But I used to have this paralyzing reaction to when people would raise their voice, even if they weren't, you know, necessarily being aggressive or, you know, being like swearing or criticizing, but like the tone of voice would go up, and my body would like almost feel tingly and numb. And so I would do the shutdown. So even though, you know, it says reactionary behaviors, that doesn't always mean we're acting out. Sometimes the shutdown is kind of our reactionary behavior. And so where this can sometimes, I guess, I don't want to say get us into trouble, but where it's not always helpful is that two things can happen, you know, within these reactions that we have. We can unintentionally perpetuate our internal vulnerability. So I'll give an example of what that means. If you have a trigger in terms of, you know, rejection, and you say you text a friend, okay, and they're not getting back to you, and this is a trigger, right? So if it's not, it might be like, oh, that's a little annoying, whatever. But if it's a trigger, you may now be in, they don't care about me. I don't even know I'm in this friendship. I'm just, whatever. I'm just not going to text him or her back. I might be done with this relationship. So how that could, you know, that reaction, if you're just going to cut the friend off, how that can unintentionally perpetuate your vulnerability is, you know, we all have an innate need for belonging and connection. And so if you are needing, you know, if you reached out to your friend because you were needing connection, and reacted in that way because of the trigger, you know, you're actually cutting yourself off even further from that connection with that person by just shutting down the friendship or, you know, refusing to engage with them any further. So I don't share this, you know, for shaming or so you can judge yourself, but just, you know, to start to bring awareness how unintentionally we can reinforce our emotional triggers in different relationships based on how we react. Or we can unintentionally trigger the other person with our reaction. And a term used for that is the neural Wi-Fi. So, you know, if my husband, you know, raises his voice because he's upset about, actually recent incident, our dog had an accident on the floor, and that's frustrating for my husband. So, you know, if he's now upset or raising his voice and frustrated in the moment, and if I come at him like, you need to calm down, I don't actually do this, but you need to just calm down, you're overreacting, quit being such a jerk, da-da-da-da-da. I'm probably going to escalate his anger because, you know, or might trigger him. If he has a sensitivity to criticism or judgment and I'm doing this, you know, it may trigger him, and now we're both way up here. And I'm sure we've all been in situations, whether it's with our, you know, our life partners or with friendships or even a colleague at work, when we're up in this space, usually things aren't going very well. And there's not a whole lot of genuine communication going on, because these reactionary behaviors are a defense mechanism, right? They're our way of trying to protect ourselves in that moment. And I use the word reactionary because, you know, there's a difference between responding to a situation and reacting. And when we're in an emotional trigger, it is often this automatic reaction. So you may not even, have a moment to think about it, or you may not even be consciously thinking, I'm going to get really angry and, tell my partner, he's wrong or she's wrong. It's just this kind of hair trigger reaction that can sometimes happen. And we're not in, and I put it in quotes, we're not in our right mind. This does not mean we're crazy. Sometimes I get that question from clients, does this make me crazy because I, overreact in this situation, or my partner actually says I'm crazy when I react this way? No, you're not crazy, but we are not in our right mind. And what I mean by that, and I'll go into it in much more depth because I'm going to kind of go through what's actually happening in our body and our brains when we're triggered. But what's actually happening is we're not having, our emotional center is on fire and just lit right up. Our physiology, whether it's, usually our heart rate increases or maybe there's tension, and we're not engaging the front part of our brain properly. And that is where regulation, decision-making, all of those functions lie. So we really aren't in our right mind. Doesn't mean we're completely out of it or crazy, but we're not in our right mind, and we're not on a level to be able to effectively communicate or have social engagement. And I put the attack, defend. Those are usually the styles, right, in which we're reacting. If a friend maybe brings up to you, they're, I don't know, maybe upset that you don't have enough time for them lately. You may go to, yeah, but, I have this going on and this, and with the kids, and I'm busy, and, it's that defensive kind of reaction. And so a lot of people, will ask, well, like, why do I even have this emotional trigger? And I mean, in my own process, I've asked myself the same question. Like, what is this about? Where does this come from? Why, with the yelling for myself, like, why does that make me feel completely paralyzed and like I can't even find my voice when, for the most part, I'm a quite confident, articulate person. So I really feel, I wouldn't say so much anymore, but when I was first working with that trigger, I can remember moments when I literally felt paralyzed within myself. And so when it comes to emotional triggers, they arise from historical, and then I put childhood experiences. So you may be able to link, in terms of historical, you may have an emotional trigger around, possibly trust. Perhaps in a romantic relationship, there have been infidelities, and maybe in several relationships, there were infidelities. And now you find yourself very, very triggered, even if your partner comes home 10 minutes late. So there's, in context to our adulthood, but usually if we really trace an emotional trigger back, it will link back to our childhood experiences. And this isn't with the intention of let's blame our parents, for everything. I genuinely believe and always put into context, our parents did the best with what they had. However, in our, those first 7 years of life, our primary caregivers are that like a very, very big influence. And then there's attachment theory involved in that. So usually our emotional triggers arise from our childhood. They could be, could have been a painful experience. So perhaps, you had a parent who was quite critical of you when you were growing up, or, was kind of always on you and that feeling of like never good enough. Or maybe they rejected, didn't want physical touch, or just rejected, you felt rejected in some way from them. And then the other part could be, not necessarily getting what we needed. So, I had wonderful parents, and yet, and they did the best with what they had, but there were pieces when I've done my own work that I realized I didn't get what I needed. And an example of that might be, you know, just that experience of feeling truly understood or seen or kind of accepted for who you were. So if, you know, that was the experience, we may generate an emotional trigger around rejection. So that's how they can link. And they can be linked also to those old unresolved experiences. So in brackets, you'll see I have the little t versus big T. Big T, and both of them are in relation to trauma. So big T trauma would be, you know, if in your childhood there was abuse, you know, verbal, sexual, physical. And again, those trauma triggers are a bit more complex than these emotional triggers we're talking about now. But the little t, you know, if we experienced, I don't know if your childhood experience was, you know, remembering often going to your parents maybe for physical comfort, and that wasn't something they knew how to respond to in a nurturing way, you know, and that was a pattern throughout childhood, that, you know, that could absolutely be like a little t. So it's not so much like PTSD trauma, big T, but over and over and over having that experience of reaching out and getting that rejection in return can absolutely have an impact on, you know, how we see ourselves and can develop into emotional triggers. So this is, I guess, kind of an overview of what our emotional triggers are, like what are they? What happens to us when we are triggered in terms of our behavior, and where do they come from? And in our experiential, we'll have a chance to explore that at a bit deeper level. But I did want to just review, not in huge depth, but what is actually happening within our system when we have an emotional trigger. Because sometimes to be able to understand what's going on, it can be helpful in a couple ways. It can help us be more aware of when it's happening. It can help us to stay out of judgment of ourselves. You know, if your, say your reaction, if you have emotional trigger on reaction and you get very attacking, or sorry, you have an emotional trigger around rejection and you've experienced rejection and you are now kind of attacking the other person, right? Like, whatever, I don't even care about you, da-da-da-da-da. You don't mean anything to me. Then we can start to judge ourselves, like, I'm a bad person, shame on me, why am I such a, you know, a B word, like all of those negative judgments. And I find a lot of people have those negative self-perceptions about themselves because of those reactionary behaviors. So I wanted to go over the science of what's happening in our bodies with the hopes of being able to, you know, look at, you know, our emotional triggers and these behaviors, because, you know, they don't always help us in terms of our relationship and can impact our ability to, you know, either maintain relationships or, you know, maintain that really healthy connection that we all need. So to help stay out of judgment and to really understand what exactly is happening when those emotional triggers are going off. So the limbic system is kind of the central system for our emotional selves. And I put here Flipping Your Lid from Dan Siegel. So if you want to, at any point, you know, jot a note down. So Dan Siegel has on YouTube great videos, and he has, I'm not going to go through it all, but he has a hand model on how the brain works. So I will give kind of a quick and dirty version, but if you want to know a bit more in terms of the detail, if you just go on YouTube and Google Dan Siegel or search for Dan Siegel brain hand model, he has, I think it's about an 8-minute video that he goes over what's happening. But the quick and dirty version, right? So when we have that huge emotional reaction, this limbic system, this inner part of our brain, is firing like crazy, okay? So this is our limbic system. This is our cortex. And that, again, the functions of the cortex, I have it listed for body regulation, you know, the brakes or the accelerator in terms of our emotion, our ability to tune into other people, response flexibility, our rational thinking, our decision making, and there are other functions as well. So normally, this part of our brain really helps us regulate. But when we have a strong and intense emotional reaction or emotional trigger, he calls what we do flipping our lid. And we don't have the same access. This part of the brain is trying to regulate the limbic system, but the limbic system's firing so strongly that we almost become, it does become not literally detached, but our cortex functions become disinhibited. And so we do not have the same capacity to regulate ourselves, to genuinely connect, with the other person in terms of what they're saying, what they're trying to communicate. We don't have that ability to tune into them the same as we would, if we were in a calmer place. And so, in terms of that flipping the lid, we genuinely are disinhibited. And this is why, perhaps when other people have been triggered, you may have said, calm down, or you've tried to reason with them with logic, and it doesn't work because, those functions are disinhibited. So we'll go into it in more length, but what we want to do first is be able to regulate and calm the brain so that these functions can be engaged again. So when we're triggered, we flip our lid. The other part that I want to review that relays into emotional triggers is the hippocampus. So it is a part of the limbic system, and its primary function is memory. So again, feel free to look for podcasts or YouTube videos that will go in a much more elaborate explanation. But for the sake of emotional triggers, I just wanted to go over two specific types of memory. So we have our explicit memory, which is our recall and conscious remembering. So explicit memory would be, an example, if I could remember my 8th birthday, and I might remember who was there, what I was wearing, the gifts I got, how I felt that day, when I woke up in the morning. So it's a recall of, an event. Or it could be what you ate for lunch today. Being able to remember where you were, what it tasted like, and you have a sense of yourself within that memory. The other one is implicit memory. And so it's not a conscious remembering. And one of the examples I'll give, and that's on here, is learning to ride a bike. So in the beginning, when you're learning to ride a bike, there's a lot of things that need to be considered. So the balance, the pedals, the handlebars, not hitting, obstacles along the way, trying to stay straight. And then over time and over time and over time and over time, pretty soon you're on the bike and you're not even consciously aware that you're remembering and keeping track of all of those things or holding all of those things, in your mind. Your brain is just automatically riding the bike. You might be chatting with a friend and doing other things. So you're not actually aware of the remembering, even though literally your body is, because your body's still functioning. And then this type of memory occurs before explicit memory developmentally. So we have implicit memories within us of infancy. I believe, in some studies like in utero, but we can't, in terms of explicit, at least I can't go back and recall what the day of my birth was like, and remember, who was there and what they said and how I felt. Those in our early developmental stages, it's the implicit memory that develops first. And so with context to, emotional implicit memory, an example would be, your partner asks you to help out more on the house. And they ask, respectfully, and you perceive it as criticism. And, that they're attacking you and judging you and implying that you are failing as a partner. This may be an emotional trigger, likely. And again, it's because it's not that the channel's wrong, but the volume is way high. And so how this may be linked to an implicit memory is perhaps as a child, right? You were often told that you needed to step it up. You weren't doing enough around the house. Maybe you were criticized for being lazy or a slob. And so now any situation that there's even a hint, right, of that criticism or judgment, and your body, is responding in that moment as strongly, as if your partner were actually calling you a slob and calling you lazy. So it's, again, the correct channel, but the volume's too high. So the last part, just in terms of kind of brain science and our nervous system, that I just wanted to go over quickly is the polyvagal theory. So we now know about the flip your lid. We know that our emotional triggers are influenced by our implicit memories. So they're just these body memories that we may not even be able to recall. But yet there's that really strong, very real physiological and emotional reaction. And then the last piece I want to go over is the polyvagal theory. So Dr. Stephen Porges was, one of the groundbreakers in terms of the polyvagal theory. I think it was in the 80s, but my fact recall isn't the greatest. But I did put his name there if you wanted to do a bit more research. So the main points in terms of the polyvagal theory and how it connects to our emotional triggers is, so it's the vagus nerve that it refers to, this theory. And it's the largest, most primitive nerve in our body. And what Dr. Porges said that's unique about the vagus nerve, well, it's a freeway from body to brain. So he had said in his research, he found that 80% of the time, the vagus nerve processes bottom up. And what that means is our bodies are responding, right, before we have, maybe a cognitive awareness or a rational reason or an understanding. Like, it happens kind of before cognitive thought and an intellectual engagement. And, it's the largest, most primitive. So I believe most species have a vagus nerve, and it's, kind of like a safety, I guess, sensor. And what it does is it's constantly, so our bodies are constantly scanning the environment to see whether it's safe or unsafe. I don't necessarily know at the rate, whether it's every 20 minutes or every 30 seconds, but our bodies are constantly, just sensing in our environment and assessing and detecting threat or risk. And so the term that Dr. Porges deemed was neuroception. And that's the definition of, how our body, so that bottom up processing, is just assessing and detecting risk or threat in the environment. And the key piece is without our conscious awareness. So it's not something, when I go for a walk outside, I'm not every 30 seconds, I'm not saying, scan the area for threat. Be alert for threat. It's not something that we're consciously doing. It's, in terms of primitive, it's for survival, right? So our bodies are just constantly sensing for threat or risk. And it's more of an intuitive and primitive response in that whole bottom up processing. And so when it comes to emotional, well, I'll go over, the different types of nervous systems first. And so we have our parasympathetic nervous system, and that's our rest and repair nervous system. The one that we're going to talk a little bit more about is the sympathetic nervous system, because that is usually what's activated when, that vagus nerve detects any kind of risk or threat. The parasympathetic nervous system does its job. It releases cortisol, norepinephrine. It's that fight, flight, or freeze response. And we're now activated, right? A threat has been detected and we're ready to react. Hence come the behavioral reactions and emotional triggers. And so the key, I guess, when it comes to emotional triggers is we're detecting, so if I get negative feedback from my boss, but it's done in a respectful manner, if it's an emotional trigger, my body is responding genuinely as though there's a threat happening. So with emotional triggers, there's not an actual threat, right, to like our well-being or our safety or our lives. Sometimes with PTSD and the big trauma triggers, that holds true. But with emotional triggers, it's actually, when you think of the example with the boss and the feedback, like that's something that's important, right? To be able to get feedback on our job performance. So that emotional trigger reaction engages the sympathetic nervous system and that reaction, but there's not actually a threat. My boss is not coming in, to hurt me in any way, or to fire even, but our body is genuinely responding as though there is a threat. So I want that to be kind of clear that it is a bit of a misinterpretation. Again, right channel to the volume's too high, but the response is very, very real in our bodies. And it does feel as though, like our heart rate goes up. Sometimes we get really hot. I was speaking earlier about one of my reactions to triggers was like complete numb and almost like tingly. So they're genuine and they're real. We're not making them up. Our body is literally detecting a threat. And so the perception of this risk leads to our overreaction to certain situations. And most of our senses are disinhibited when when our parasympathetic nervous system has been alerted and it's going off. It was quite interesting. He said most of our senses are inhibited, including, pardon me, our ears. So what he was explaining was that, our inner ears actually constrict when we're in this threat mode. They constrict because they're now, from a very primitive standpoint, they're now only listening to and hypersensitive to higher low tones. And what he described was like looking for predators, right? So we're not able to process the spoken language in the same way. Pardon me. So this is part of the effects of like flipping the lid. We genuinely are not able to process information the same way. So if you've ever been, I always think of the term like a blind rage. I believe, if that's an emotional trigger, sometimes people probably just completely feel out of their skin and unable to communicate or even have like logical thought or hear what the other person is actually trying to communicate to them. So with emotional triggers, I mentioned that already, there's not an actual threat of physical safety. It's more of a threat to the relational connection. So, if I have an emotional trigger for rejection and my partner comes to me and says, or I say, you want to do something tonight or tomorrow night, it's the weekend, and his response is no. If that's an emotional trigger, I might, you don't love me. I don't even know why I bother trying to even ask you to do things. So my reaction is to the threat of the connection of the relationship. It's not as though him saying no is an actual threat to my physical safety. So I hope that delineation is clear in terms of our body is genuinely responding to the threat, but with an emotional trigger, we're not actually in any physical harm. So some common, I think I've mentioned quite a few, but some common examples: criticism, rejection, abandonment, judgment, yelling, controlling, unfairness, and in brackets I put perceived or otherwise. I do want to take a moment just to clarify too, if you're thinking, oh, I have an emotional trigger around rejection, but you actually are constantly rejected by your partner, you may notice that emotional trigger has even ramped up over time because it's been your true experience is to have that rejection, chances are it still links back to childhood. But sometimes we have those patterns in our relationship, and we notice that the emotional trigger sometimes amps up and amps up and amps up over time. And then the other thing is, the overall daily stress we experience, the more frequent, that should say the higher overall daily stress we experience, the more frequent and intense the emotional triggers will be. So if our nervous systems are already taxed and excreting cortisol and norepinephrine and, constantly feeling like in that fight, flight, or freeze, you may notice times when, perhaps you have an emotional trigger around rejection, but you notice when you're really stressed out in other areas of life, that those emotional triggers are even stronger. And it's a legitimate experience because the nervous system's already taxed. So we become hyper sensitive. If we're already in a state of kind of alert and really, really scanning the environment now intently for threat, we're probably going to notice, those potential threats way easier. So why bother working on them? I don't know about you guys, but when I did a lot of reflecting in my own work on emotional triggers, I realized that, I don't want to say this in a judgy way, but I'm going to be factual. In my reactions and those triggers were actually creating a lot of disconnect in relationships for me. And that doesn't feel good. Like, we are a social species and we are wired for connection and belonging and social interaction. And so if our emotional triggers are interrupting our ability to do that, our relationships may suffer in all areas. And then the other part was, it doesn't feel good. Like, I didn't feel good about myself. If I would become really defensive around something, or if I would, maybe like become super independent because I didn't want to get rejected by somebody, so I'll reject you first. Like, those things didn't feel good. So we work on them to improve how we can perceive ourselves, and also to be able to improve our ability to connect and engage with other people, because it's a need that we have. So here's where some of the work, you'll have an opportunity to do a bit of reflection. So when we're working through emotional triggers, we want to first be able to identify, is this a trigger? And one of the questions that I sometimes will ask myself is this live? Is my emotional response, in correspondence to the situation that's happening? So, the boss feedback, if I get feedback about job performance, and how to improve it, and my response is very, offended, and how dare you, and da-da-da-da-da, that is more likely connected to the implicit memory, right? Me hating my boss or yelling at them or wanting to quit my job because of some performance feedback isn't, congruent with the situation that's happening. So that's what I mean by live. Does your emotional response match kind of what the situation is? Or, and I'll ask myself the other one, is this live, or is it influenced by implicit memory? Is this, something from my past that's getting recalled in this moment? Is my volume too high? So that's one way to suss out if something's an emotional trigger for yourself. If we are unable to separate, it will actually feel as though the person is hurting you the same way you experienced it in your implicit memory. So you may, have experienced times when, again, that partner maybe has asked something of you, to step it up, or could you do more on the house, or could you help me out in this way? And if you have an emotional trigger around any kind of criticism, in that moment, it may feel as though your partner is like yelling and screaming and degrading you. So it's really important that we can learn how to separate that. Because if that's the perception of the other person, you can see how that would create huge misattunement in the relationship. And it would be really painful, really, to believe that your partner would want to hurt you or criticize you or degrade you. So the name it to tame it, that's another Dan Siegel term. And what that simply means is being able to name it kind of in the moment, right? Okay, here it is. You know, my friend or my boss or my partner is sharing something with me that is, you know, hits an emotional trigger. And I'm just going to be really aware of that so that I can, we'll talk about how to regulate, but so that I can stay connected to myself and not go into those reactionary behaviors. And the second, you know, important key part is the awareness in the moment. So just being aware of that physiological response, what is happening in your body and where. You know, sometimes we're all up here, but we're not necessarily connected to our body. So to really start bringing that awareness of, how do I know? How does my body react when I'm triggered? And it may be different. So you may have more than one emotional trigger. I know I've shared a couple of mine. And my physiological reaction to loud, you know, yelling or anger is the shutdown. But my reaction to the perception of rejection was very like strong and like, wouldn't necessarily say it, but my stance would be like, well, I don't need you. You know, so depending on the trigger, we may react differently. So just developing that awareness. And then the third piece is the regulation. So being able to calm our brain and our physiology. So to settle the vagus nerve, you know, to put the lid back on, and to really calm ourselves so that we can get to a place of being able, you know, to effectively engage in social interaction. So we're going to unpack it a little bit more. So I encourage you, if you have a pen or if you want to get your phone, to take notes. Which situations do you have strong emotional or physiological response to? So you may have already identified it, or you may have even, you know, come to this webinar knowing what your emotional trigger was, just not sure what to do with it. And I have the term compassionate curiosity. I believe that's from Gabor Mate. I do encourage, this is not about judging yourself. This is not about flagellating yourself for having these reactions and having these triggers and shame on you. I love the term compassionate curiosity because it's really, really wanting to be curious about the why from a loving place. You know, why do I react this way in certain situations? You can also ask to find your triggers. What negative beliefs do you hold about yourself? It can be kind of a clue. It's not so much a trigger for me now, but before I had this belief about not being smart. So any perception of, you know, what I would read as someone calling me stupid or implying I was stupid would, you know, be a trigger for me. So that was an internal belief I had, that I was stupid. And then I noticed that any implications of that, I would have those strong emotional responses too. So any negative beliefs you have about yourself could give you some clues. And then I want you to think about what happens in your body. Right? So for the sake of the webinar, I would encourage you just to stay with one trigger. So what happens to your body in those situations where you're feeling triggered, emotionally triggered? And then the second piece, or the last piece, how do you typically react in those moments? So again, it's that flip your lid reaction. Do you defend? Do you attack? Do you shut down? Passive aggressive? You know, what are the reactions when you're emotionally triggered? And just take a moment to jot these down. And while you write them down, I just put the note at the bottom. It's not about judging whether your feelings are right or wrong. Instead, it's like the curiosity as to why you feel this way, because it's a genuine response happening in your body. So we're not here to judge you and say that's silly or don't feel that way. It's just be curious as to why it's there. Why is that coming up so intensely in those situations? So the regulation piece is really important. So once you've identified, what your triggers are, and in the moment when you've identified your trigger, deep breathing, as simple as it sounds, is so, so key. So, over the years, but also in preparing for this webinar, I was listening to different schools of thoughts, and every single one, whether it was scientific or based on the polyvagal, or it was more meditation based or spiritual, it was all about being able to regulate ourselves in those moments and to say to the body that you're safe. Because with polyvagal theory, if we've detected a threat, our body's defense system is to put ourselves on alert. And so if our lids are flipped, we don't have that ability to regulate and all that kind of stuff. So the breath is the quickest, most powerful way to say to our bodies, it's okay, you're safe, and begin to settle that physiological reaction of the emotional trigger. It brings us back to the place of social engagement. So once, our physiology is a bit calm, we've given that subconscious message to our body through our breath, like it's okay, you're not in danger in this moment. Then we're able to have that genuine social interaction, because now we're able to take on the other person's perspective. We're able to tune into our ability for compassion and empathy and understanding and perspective taking. So there's 2 breaths I'm going to review with you quickly, because I know I want to save time for the experiential. So there's the 4-7-8 relaxing breath. This is, I guess what I would say is like the quickest way to settle the nervous system. And the reason that is, it has a shorter inhale. So the inhale engages our sympathetic nervous system, right? The activation. And the exhale helps us engage our parasympathetic nervous system. So the 4 is the inhale, 7 is a hold, 8 is the exhale through the mouth. And I'm gonna do it in a moment, but for the relaxing breath with the exhale, you want to put your tongue at the back of your teeth, and it will almost make a bit of a whooshing noise. So it's just gently, you don't have to force it against your teeth, but just gently holding it there, and it'll sound something like a whoosh or a whistle. So the relaxing breath, I'll do it and I'll count with my fingers, but it would be, I welcome you to do it with me. Inhale for, hold, and exhale for 8. So if you can do a few rounds of that, the hold helps to slow the heart rate, and especially that longer exhale will really help you get into that calmer state in your body. And the cleansing breath is probably the most basic deep breath, and it's just an inhale and then a slow exhale through the mouth. And the slower the better, because again, it engages that parasympathetic nervous system, which is that rest, repair, that messaging to the body that it's okay, it's safe. That will be most helpful, the breathing. And then the name it to tame it. So it helps us to be able to look at it. So if I'm triggered, take a breath. Okay, I'm a little calmer. I'm going to say to myself, hey, Sheila, this is a trigger for you. This is a tough one. Just keep breathing, like just doing that inner dialogue, because then naming it helps to step away from it. And it also helps from me, projecting onto the person, like they're trying to hurt me and they're just wanting me to make me feel stupid, or they're wanting to make me feel rejected and they don't care about me. So the naming it, as an emotional trigger helps us to kind of look at it in a bit more of, I guess, objective kind of perspective. And then the deeper processing we're going to do right now. I did put, though, this will not always go as planned. Okay, so these steps, yes, they're simple in terms of, deep breathe, name it. It won't always go well, because again, those emotional triggers are based on those implicit memories, and it's wired, right? So we're just constantly searching for, those situations that are, going to be perceived as a threat. So it will take practice. I know for some of my triggers, I was able to kind of, I don't want to say completely get over, but I don't feel that strong response anymore. And others took, I'm going to say, a couple years to be able to get to a place where I can now stay in a place of social engagement and not go, and not flip my lid at all. So be gentle with yourself, but keep trying. Okay, so we're going to work through an emotional trigger. So I want you to think of a situation, the last time that you were triggered, and to jot it down. So just, it doesn't have to be the whole story or the whole paragraph, but just enough so that you know what the situation was. So once you've done that, how did it feel in your body? And I want you to write down those sensations. Was it hot? Were you tense? Was your heart rate increased? Was it, maybe more of a fear reaction? That paralysis, that I was kind of describing earlier, where you almost feel a little bit tingly or numb. Just kind of write down how you felt in your body in that situation. And then next, in that moment, I felt. So to choose the one that fits most for this situation. A couple may connect, but the one that most fits the situation that you're, excuse me, holding in your mind right now. Was it excluded, unheard, judged, disrespected, uncared for, ignored, forgotten, unloved, frustrated, trapped, like I couldn't speak up, controlled, powerless, scolded, blamed, a lack of affection, lonely, like a bad guy, unsafe, like it was unfair, disconnected, or lack of passion, or manipulated. So again, just whichever one really resonates the most for you regarding that situation. And I will give a bit of an apology. It's my timing and planning. I'm kind of going through this a bit quicker than I intended, but I'm just trying to be mindful of the time. I may go over a little bit, so I invite you to stay and join, but I understand if you need to leave right at 8. So the fifth step is I now want you to think, this may take a moment, and sometimes when I'm wanting to go inward, closing my eyes can help, or even just looking down helps to engage, going inward. So I want you to think of the first time you remembered feeling the way that you just wrote down, that one word that you just identified. And to try to connect that to a memory. Ideally as a child. And if you're struggling, again, this is the experiential, and the handout will be posted along with the video. So if you don't have answers, just to not judge yourself. Like I recognize, I own that I'm going through a little quicker, but you can always come back to it in terms of the video recording and be able to pause it, or you can do the handout. That'll be linked to the video. So if you have that memory, I'm going to invite you now. We're going to just do a brief guided visualization. So you can place your hands on your heart if that feels right to do so, and close your eyes. And we're just going to start with 2 cleansing breaths, inhaling for 3, 2, 1, and exhaling through the mouth for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And again, inhale, 3, 2, 1, and exhale, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And at any time, you can feel free to open your eyes if it becomes too uncomfortable, or you can use your breath again to regulate. But in your mind's eye, I want you to recall that memory of yourself as a child when you felt that way, and whether you're seeing a perfectly clear image or not, just setting the intention, and holding the perception of that image is just as effective. I want you to recall that situation. And maybe you can even connect to how you were feeling in that moment. You may even see in your mind's eye, your body language. Just hold some of those details in your focus. And then I want you to ask, what was it that I was truly needing in that moment? Was I needing comfort, acceptance, to be heard, a boundary, a reassurance? Just try to connect to what were you really needing in that situation. And again, whether it's come to you or not, you can revisit this exercise at any time. For the sake of the webinar, I just invite you to slowly bring your awareness back into the room and open your eyes when you feel ready. And I want you to write down that need, because often the need, from our childhood memory will likely be the same need in our emotional triggers. So for an example, for myself around the anger, I needed, so when I was little, anger at times was quite scary and was aggressive. So now when there is really loud anger, I need a bit of a boundary. And I communicated that to my husband and what that would look like so that I'm not triggering him. But just to help you to see how we can begin to identify what we're really needing in those situations. And in some moments, we'll be able to meet that need for ourselves. So I know another trigger that I used to have, doesn't bother me so much anymore, but I think I mentioned it earlier, like the stupid. If that ever comes up now, I can meet my own need, which is just reassurance of the truth, right? That I'm not an idiot, or I'm not stupid, and that I'm bright or intelligent. So just giving myself that reassurance, and that can help myself in the moment. So we don't always need the other person to meet the need, but sometimes it can be really connecting to share that with our partners or friends or parents or bosses. And sometimes it can just guide us in terms of being able to ask for what we need. Okay, so I see we have a question, so I'm going to connect to it. Okay, so I have a question about, what about rejection or abandonment? Would you be okay to give me a little more context around that? Like in terms of, pardon me, if rejection or abandonment is a trigger, like how to respond. So while you're typing back, in terms of the need for rejection or abandonment, the need was probably to closeness, connection, right? And depending on the flavor of the rejection and abandonment can be a bit different, but perhaps there was a true abandonment in childhood. And now every time in the adult relationship, the partner maybe even withdrawals, or doesn't show up on time. Okay, and the childhood memories abandonment. What you're likely needing is the closeness. And what I would encourage, I'm saying it's with your partner, what you could do, and I'm going to go more into this too in my next webinar with couples. But what do you mean by closeness? So the first thing I would encourage you to do is to share that this is a trigger with your partner. If your partner does come home late, I would encourage use the breath, and the need, there might be two. So the need might be reassuring yourself, right? Like, my partner is not giving me evidence of leaving, my partner is late coming home. He or she is not abandoning me, not leaving me, not, so that reassurance to help settle your nervous system. And then you can also let your partner know about the trigger, so that he or she may be a bit more conscientious in terms of, if they do come home late and they notice you're on edge, hopefully they'll be able to have a bit more of a compassionate response to that emotional trigger. Does that help? I'll give you a moment, to respond. And then I'm going to go to, just to review, I mentioned it already, that the next webinar is going to be February 6th from 7 to 8 p.m. And it's going to be, I guess it's going to, I don't know what the right word is, not cascade, but build onto, that's the word I'm looking for, build onto this webinar, but be more in context to like co-regulation. So how we can be attuned to our partner's triggers, how we can co-regulate in those moments so that it doesn't spin into what's called in the EFT for couples world, the negative cycle, when both people are now triggered and there's no genuine social interaction occurring. So yeah, we'll be able to look at emotional triggers in context to romantic relationships and partnerships. Okay. Tell me so I have another question, what the unmet need is when you feel controlled. What I might encourage, because it could be different, right? So everybody has their own experiences, because I can speak from my perspective, because I don't know, I'm realizing I got a lot of triggers. That was something that it's funny, we've worked through, but both my husband and I cannot stand. It was a big trigger for both of us. But we each had different needs. So to answer that question, I apologize that it's not black and white, but I would encourage you to go back kind of to that visualization, right? And really truly experience yourself, in that childhood memory, and to try to let your intuition guide you. Like, what was it that you were needing? Was it being able to have a voice? Were you needing, the ability to make your own decisions? So I can't answer that for sure, because it will be based on people's individual experiences. Yeah, so if you can go back to that meditation, it might become clearer for you. Wow, I cannot believe how quickly an hour went by. Thank all of you for joining. I was very excited to see how many people signed up for this webinar, and hopefully you'll join the next as well. And just as a reminder, or not as a reminder, but just to let you all know, you may have seen this already in our social media, but for the month of January, every day, for the month of January, we're having gratitude challenge. So every day there's going to be a prompt in terms of being able to focus on gratitude. And the purpose of that is there's a lot of research in terms of practicing gratitude and how it can help, especially if you're in the northern Ontario in the winter months. It can get kind of depressing. So practicing gratitude on a daily basis can help increase our experience of joy. It can kind of change the lens sometimes in which we see the world. So feel free to join us if you would like. And I'm going to stop the share right now because I thought I saw another question. Oh, perfect. It was just a response. Okay, you're welcome. All right. Again, thank you all for joining. I hope there was something that you could take from this webinar, and absolutely welcome you to join the next one. I will have a brief review of what emotional triggers are, but the content will be mostly about the co-regulation within partnerships. So I wish you all a wonderful evening or rest of your day, and hopefully we'll connect with you in February. Take care.